welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're deconstructing one of the absolute most pivotal events in human history, the attack on Pearl Harbor. Now, we always hear about the what and the when of December 7th, 1941, but today, we're actually diving deep into the why. We're going to break down the strategic rationale, the literally unbelievable geographical challenges, and ultimately the massive, monumental miscalculations that defined this historic strike. So let's dive right into this. I want you to keep this central question in the back of your mind as we go. Was this attack a totally necessary act of survival for Japan, or was it just a desperate, high-stakes gamble that ended up dooming their entire empire? To really get that, we have to rewind just a bit and look at the absolute pressure cooker that was the geopolitical landscape of the Pacific in 1941. Part 1. The Fight for Oil. By the third year of World War II, Japan was on the move. They were rapidly expanding this massive empire across Asia, occupying Korea, Taiwan, huge chunks of China, and building up bases in Vietnam. But as you can imagine, this aggressive expansion created some massive friction with Western powers, who had their own colonies and interests right there in the Pacific. And that pushback, it came in the form of a totally crippling embargo. The US, the UK, and the Netherlands completely cut off Japan's oil supply. We're talking about ending a staggering 90% of Japan's oil imports in a flash. And you just cannot run a military empire, let alone fight a global war, without oil. Japan's reserves were draining incredibly fast, and they were, for all intents and purposes, backed right into a corner. Because of that, Japan really felt forced to act, and their geographical logic actually followed three very distinct steps. First off, they desperately needed to secure the massive oil reserves down in Indonesia and Malaysia. Simple enough, right? But step two, the American colony of the Philippines was sitting right smack in their path. It was an obstacle they absolutely had to neutralize to keep their supply lines safe. Which brings us to step three. To stop the US from jumping in and defending the Philippines, Japan realized they had to wipe out America's main power base in the Pacific. They had to destroy Pearl Harbor. Part 2. Planning the impossible. To pull off this seemingly impossible third step, Japan turned to one of their most brilliant, experienced military minds, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. And what's really fascinating about Yamamoto is that he had actually served as a naval attaché in the United States. He knew their industrial power firsthand, and he specifically advised his own government not to fight the Americans. But the government insisted. So Yamamoto, a guy who had famously lost 2 fingers fighting the Russians back in 1905, was ordered to plan the strike anyway. And he was facing an immense geographical nightmare. Pearl Harbor is on Oahu, and right at its center is Ford Island. This extremely narrow, heavily patrolled sea passage formed a natural gateway that made sneaking ships in for a surprise naval attack literally impossible. Yamamoto realized right away that a totally radical approach was required. The only way to hit them by surprise, it had to come from the sky. When you stack up the opposing forces, the sheer scale of what they were attempting is just incredible. The Japanese pulled together the First Air Fleet, this massive armada featuring 6 aircraft carriers and 414 planes. Sitting across from them, the U.S. Pacific Fleet had about 100 ships in the area, including 8 highly prized battleships, and roughly 400 planes. To actually deliver this blow, the Japanese fleet traveled 5,000 kilometers from the Kuril Islands. And to make sure they weren't spotted, they sailed in this crazy zigzag pattern, entirely, completely off the traditional naval routes, and maintained absolute strict radio silence. They were totally off the grid. Part 3. Warnings ignored. Now here is where the story takes a really shocking turn. Despite all of Japan's extreme secrecy, the United States was actually swimming in intelligence that an attack was coming. It's a shocking cascade of ignored warnings that basically allowed the Japanese fleet to just slip right through the cracks. Get this, the US had decoded 83 of Yamamoto's naval messages. They intercepted warnings straight from Tokyo, telling the Japanese embassy in Washington to prepare for major action. There was literally a newspaper headline in Hawaii on November 30th that read, "Japan may strike over weekend." No way, right? And the official warning Washington finally sent to the base, it wasn't even marked urgent. It arrived after the attack had already started. Even that very morning, the USS Ward fired on and actually destroyed a Japanese submarine right outside the harbor. But the alert just wasn't taken seriously. Now, while some conspiracy theories like to claim President Franklin D. Roosevelt allowed the attack to happen just to drag the U.S. into the war, historians and experts firmly attribute this whole catastrophic failure to routine negligence. There were just so many false alarms leading up to this that daily alerts were treated as completely routine, a classic case of the boy who cried wolf. Part 4, Day of the Attack. The explosive climax finally arrived on the morning of December 7th, 1941. The Japanese fleet had made it about 370 kilometers north of Oahu, totally undetected. The American fleet was completely caught off guard. At 6:15 a.m., that first wave of Japanese planes takes off into the morning sky. Then, at 7:02 a.m., a U.S. radar station actually spots the incoming planes, a huge blip on the screen. But in just a disastrous twist of fate, the American commanders assumed they were friendly B-17 bombers that were scheduled to fly in from California that same morning. So tragically, no alarm was sounded. By 7:53 a.m., the Japanese planes were locked into position and the chilling attack signal was broadcast over the radio. Tora, Tora, Tora. Tiger, tiger, tiger. With that one code phrase, the bombing began. The Japanese planes split up, absolutely devastating the American planes sitting right wing to wing on the ground at Wheeler Field. At the same time, they started bombarding the 8 battleships anchored neatly around Ford Island. They used these specially modified torpedoes that could actually glide in the shallow harbor water, along with heavy armor-piercing bombs. One of those bombs shattered the USS Arizona, instantly sinking the mighty battleship and taking 1,177 of its crew down with it. It was absolute chaos. But amidst all this utter devastation, there were these incredible, shining acts of heroism. Take Doris Miller, known as Dory. He was a cook in the Navy. The guy had absolutely zero gunnery training, none. Yet, as this terrifying attack is raging all around him, he runs up, takes control of an anti-aircraft gun, stands his ground, and actually shoots down enemy planes. His unbelievable bravery that day earned him the Navy Cross. Part 5. A fatal miscalculation. So, after a second wave of attacks hits around 9 a.m., the Japanese had inflicted massive, sweeping damage. They had the perfect opportunity right then to launch a third, decisive strike and just wipe out the remaining infrastructure completely. But the on-field commander, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, makes a fateful decision. He decides to pack up and withdraw rather than launch that third strike. And the cost of that withdrawal? Well, look at this number. 650 million. That is the number of liters of fuel left sitting perfectly intact in those highly visible white cylindrical depots all around Pearl Harbor. Because Nagumo was running low on fuel himself and he was terrified of an American counterattack, he left the literal lifeline of the U.S. Navy completely untouched. It saved the U.S. at least 2 years of recovery time. By pulling out early, Nagumo left all of these absolutely essential targets standing: the fuel depots, the vital dry dock repair facilities, and the entire submarine base. And you know what the biggest stroke of luck for the Americans was? 3 of their most important aircraft carriers, the Enterprise, the Lexington, and the Saratoga, they were out at sea delivering planes that morning. They survived completely unscathed. Destroying them was supposed to be a key part of Yamamoto's original plan. Because they survived, this was ultimately a hugely incomplete victory for Japan. That being said, the immediate toll was undeniably devastating. Just look at the brutal math here. The sheer imbalance of losses is staggering. The United States lost or suffered heavy damage to 21 ships and 347 planes. A tragic 2,335 American lives were lost. In stark contrast, the Japanese suffered incredibly minimal casualties: 29 planes, 5 submarines, and 64 lives lost. Strictly speaking, it was a massive, immediate tactical win for Japan. But back in Japan, the brilliant Admiral Yamamoto, he wasn't celebrating at all. He recognized the catastrophic strategic error they had just made, supposedly remarking that the attack had done nothing but awaken a sleeping giant. He knew exactly what they'd just done. He understood that their temporary tactical victory had basically guaranteed a drawn-out, devastating war with an industrial powerhouse that they couldn't possibly win. Because those repair facilities were left intact, and because the ships sank in very shallow water, the U.S. quickly refloated and rebuilt its fleet. Within just months, a lot of those ships were ready to fight again. The timeline from there is just a rapid, tragic domino effect for Japan. The U.S. declares war the very next day. By April 1942, America is already bombing Tokyo. In 1943, U.S. fighters track and shoot down Yamamoto's plane. The following year, Nagumo commits suicide as U.S. forces relentlessly advance. And finally, in 1945, the atomic bombs bring about the complete and total destruction of the Japanese Empire. Which brings us right back to our original thought. In their absolutely desperate bid for short-term survival in oil, Japan executed one of the most stunning tactical surprises in all of military history. Yet, by missing the fuel, missing the aircraft carriers, and fundamentally underestimating the sheer resolve of the United States, they completely sealed their own doom. So I'll leave you with this. By seeking short-term survival, did Japan's greatest tactical success essentially guarantee its ultimate destruction? It is a profound, fascinating historical irony to think about. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep learning, keep questioning, and we'll see you next time.